So welcome everyone to this week's episode of the 5710 podcast. This week's guest we have Ahmed. I cannot pronounce your second name, so would you please pronounce it?
Ahmed Belkhodja.
Welcome from Fala Atelier, Portuguese practice, I would say, capturing headlines online for their strong visual style and a sort of almost postmodernist, I would say. So the first question I want to ask about, sorry if I've annoyed you, is the practice's interest and certainly talent in images and collages and the influence of Edward Hopper and David Hockney. You see these figures in these images. Is that purposeful? Is that something you're trying to convey, or is it just personal preferences of people you're interested in, or a style you're interested in, perhaps?
Firstly, these are painters whose characters are very practical to work with when composing an image, because they have a sort of detachment from. Very often they have a sort of detachment from their surroundings that help, and a certain approach to perspective, especially in the case of Hockney, that goes a bit in. That makes it very convenient to use in collages, but it's not really. Imagine. It's not necessarily that we try to find some sort of spiritual link with their author, and so yeah, there's that. But at the same time, I mean, in more general terms, we ended up doing collages firstly for practical reasons.
They're quick.
Yeah. They're fast, they're efficient, and somehow there are images that stay longer, that have a longer life expectancy in our eyes, because we started by doing a lot of competitions that we were losing, and proudly losing, and we realized in that process that when the images were collages and we had lost the competition, we were much happier to look back at them than when they were photorealistic renderings. So that was a bit the first discovery, and so in a way the image finds a certain kind of autonomy from the, let's say, the building as a product. So, and we were interested in that.
And your practice has a lot of competitions. Do you find you learn more and the creative process is sped up when you do a competition because there's a set deadline and probably a shorter time frame often, and you can kind of.
In a way.
Or do you lose the practical knowledge? How do you draw the balance between that?
Yeah, I mean, lately we've been doing much less competitions because we now have direct commissions in quantity, let's say. So, but it's true that competitions remain important to us as experimenting grounds. So in a competition, you don't have this sort of constant exchange with a client. That it's a different martial art in a way. So your proposal is can be more direct and more radical sometimes, and in a way to experiment it's an easier field. I have a professor who used to say that this is where architectural ideas fly the fastest, and but yeah, also very simply speaking, if you wait for somebody to commission you a museum, you will wait a long time. So.
That's very true. That's very true. I would say in your projects there's an element of simplicity of form sometimes, and maybe I would phrase not simplicity, but a lack of complexity. And do you find, is that purposeful to bring you in? That's what I look at your projects, and it encourages you to look closer at things. Look closer not only at details, but nothing is hidden away. Everything is plain and in front of you. Is that a style you develop naturally, or is it intentional to sort of make you appreciate?
It's a
wholeness of it.
Yeah, it's a strategic answer to a certain building context. So in a way, our budgets and the speed of our projects doesn't allow to put all our energy into very minute, precious details. So we have to, let's say, we have to find some sort of attractive bluntness, I would say, and
That's probably a good way to describe it. I would agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, and so so it's very strategical in a way, and you have to decide where you put the energy, where you put the money. So if you cannot make the entire room precious, you can maybe use touches of materials that will have more texture than the rest. So these are all strategical things at first, and then you try to make the most out of it in the composition, let's say.
Do you have any advice for students in the university time for finding that kind of artistic style? You know, I say Fala has a very clear identity of not only of building but of image and of production of work. Do you have any advice on how someone might find their way in that? Because quite often students, they kind of jump between mediums and they jump between stylistic, from CGI to models to modernist.
I mean, of course, we are very obsessed with consistency in a way, or so I think when we meditate a lot on what kind of representation we do, and we stick to it when the choice is made. But I also don't really have, I mean, if we actually have something you could describe as a style, it's mostly incidental. So I think it's not some...
It's a practical necessity almost.
It comes out of a lot of small decisions that become a certain logic and a certain coherence through time. But so I would say the if there is a sane way to define a style, it's to avoid looking for it, let's say, or at the very least
avoid forcing it.
And at the very least, I think you don't define a style, but by listening to advices of other people. For sure. So.
That's a fair point. I'm always interested here in what inspires architects' work, but not only architects. Is there anything outside of the built environment world? We've talked about Hopper and Hockney before. Is it musicians or poets, or is there anyone that you find yourself coming back to?
Yeah, but it's also, we have a lot of, let's say, our shared common knowledge is architecture and architects almost exclusively. A few designers also probably, but then we have particular interests, each of us, that are more personal, let's say, and that influence our contribution to the whole thing. But let's say within the office, we actually only almost exclusively discuss architects. But a lot of them, and we really, it's probably quite weird to outsiders, but I've never seen an office where names of other architects are mentioned as often as is in ours.
And who commonly comes up, or is it?
I mean, the probably the names that come the most often are Kazuo Shinohara from Japan, and a few of his pupils and architects of his generation and the next one in Japan. Alvaro Siza, of course, some Swiss architects like Peter Merkli. Then there are a few exceptions from different eras, Asplund and Leverance, for example, but it's very often actually architects, post-war architects from all around the planet, also American ones.
And do you think it's important to have an understanding within an office of what everyone likes and what everyone's thoughts are on these things, so you know that if you're suggesting a way of doing something, that your partner, maybe you have a sense of what he feels about these things? I mean, for us it's
it's very important. When somebody joins the office, very often in the first few weeks and months they will go back home very regularly with a few books to sort of study names, and because it's really, I mean, it's very important to us, because otherwise we believe that's our Esperanto, that's what we can really share, and we don't believe that much in invention, so we almost everything we do comes from another architecture, from other architectures. I'd say.
And is that something you try to convey when you bring new people in? I know in architecture schools it's a very difficult habit to break a student of trying to encourage them away from creating the idea. You know, it's quite often not something that comes out of thin air. It's something that it's a learning from previous generation and previous will learn from us kind of thing. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, we don't have the energy to try to invent new ideas for every bedroom in a way, but but that's one thing. But we don't really believe in invention, of course. But we also, let's say, references can also be dangerous in the sense that your architecture cannot only rely on an adoration of other architects. In a way, this is where, let's say, the necessary magic is to find a way to distance also yourself from them. And so this is also why I think the plurality of these architects is important. You need to look at a lot of things so that in the end what you do can detach from these things.
And what point in the process do you think it's the best time to bring in references and precedents? You know, some architects like to do it immediately. They like to go, this type of building has been done by this person and what can we learn from it? But I know of others who, some people have come in and said, we like to look at the details. We like to have the idea ourselves and try to avoid.
In our case, it's usually a discussion that comes very early on. Yeah. And in the end, actually it's true. That's something I never really thought about in this way that much, but it's true that probably we look at other architects the most in the very beginning of a process. It's a lot about typology, spatial organization, and very broad constructive intentions.
And strategies, I imagine, as well. Yeah. So the sort of more aware.
Because the detailing, in a way, depends more on the budget, the contractor, all these things. So this is something that resolves much later on, and that is very remote to, let's say, Japanese architecture of the 70s, for example. It's very difficult. I mean, of course, we can still try to relate, but
it's interesting that the big idea could be universal, but the small idea perhaps isn't. Yeah.
In a way, yes. Yeah.
Okay, the last question that we ask all of our guests is, what is your recommendation for a grand tour for a student once they've graduated to go see somewhere perhaps off the beaten track, you know, not somewhere one would normally see? Doesn't need to be architecture, it could be just a place.
Yeah. I mean, the most natural answer for us would be Japan.
Really? Anywhere in Japan or just the whole place?
I think the whole place. There is something fascinating about. Jean Baudrillard said that Japan was a satellite of planet Earth. I think it's in a way, it's, at least for us Europeans, it's extremely, extremely exotic, and at the same time extremely, extremely advanced. And let's say, there is not that, you get away from all the possibly condescending view that Westerners would have on poorer countries of the rest of the world, which of course I think Japan is totally, I think it's a satellite of planet Earth in many ways. The rest of the world feels very distant when you're there, but it's still present in a weird translated way. So but it's also worth it to go visit Portugal. And but
is there any
if I have to give really, I think probably the best answer to that question is to really look at what you love, and try to understand always why you love it. And if you have to organize some sort of grand tour, it should revolve around that.
And what is it you found love in Japan? Is it the human attitude to things, or is it the history of the place?
There are many things, but it's everything there feels
fresh.
Rediscovered in a way, and that's something that the three of us in different times actually totally fascinated us. We all worked there for a few months each, and
is the position of architect much similar over there?
Yeah, I mean, of course, urbanistically, it's extreme. It's very extreme, and it's very. There is an energy there that you rarely find in other places. But the architecture, of course, is full of fantastic stuff, and the food is amazing. Even European food is very often better in Japan than in Europe.
That's the statement. That's the statement to end on.
Even Robert Venturi said so. So no.
Okay. Thank you for coming, Ahmed, and thanks to everyone for listening to this week's episode.